Chapter 7, Mr. Rochester. People say that all that a woman wants is a quiet, safe life. I don't believe it. I had just such a life and I wasn't satisfied. Women feel just like men feel. They want excitement and adventure in their lives. They need to challenge and enlarge their minds. How can anyone suppose that a woman is happy staying all day inside the house? I had thought my life would change when I left school. It was the reason I had wanted to leave. Now, here I was, and I still felt like I was living in a prison. A beautiful prison. A mansion of a prison. What difference did it make? Day in and day out, it was the same routine. I taught Adele her lessons. I went up to the roof to draw. I had lunch and dinner with Mrs. Fairfax. A nice woman, but not a great conversationalist. I took long walks in the garden. I read, and I went to bed. October, November, December passed. January came. One morning, Adele woke up with a cold. I decided that she should stay in bed, so there were no lessons that day. I sat in the library and read. In the afternoon, Mrs. Fairfax said she had a letter she needed to post, so I volunteered to take it to the post office in the village. It was a chance to get out of the house, and I jumped at it. It was a brisk 2-mile walk. The day was particularly cold, but the sky was clear, and the scenery shone in the bright sunlight. Cows were grazing in the fields, and little birds perched on the bare tree branches, looking like brown leaves that had forgotten to fall. I came to a stretch of the road that was covered with ice. I stopped, afraid to go forward. Just as I was standing there, thinking that maybe I should cross over the field instead, I heard a horse coming. The area was completely deserted, and the clopping sound of the hooves came from around the bend of the road. I had heard that there was a spirit called Guy Trash that haunted the road. It took on the form of a horse and galloped around solitary travelers, scaring them to death. I imagined a wild horse with red eyes, a mane like a lion's, and cloven hooves like the devil's. But it was an ordinary horse that appeared. A man was riding on it. I was relieved, though my heart still beat fast. As the horse reached the ice, it took a fall, throwing the rider. The man tried to get back on his feet, but kept slipping on the ice. "Are you hurt, sir?" I asked, going near him to help. He groaned with pain and did not reply. "Can I do anything, sir?" I asked. "Don't just stand there. Give me a hand," he said rudely. His rudeness did not offend me. It was clear he was in pain. I gave him my hand, and he pulled himself up. He felt his legs and arms. "No broken bones," he said, "just a sprain." He was of medium height, but he had broad shoulders and a stocky body. He looked to be about 35. No one would call him handsome, but he had beautiful dark eyes and a strong, manly face. He acted rough, but I could tell he was not unkind. "What are you doing out here?" he said. "You shouldn't be out alone in such a deserted place." "I live quite near," I said. "At Thornfield Hall, if you know it." He gave no sign that he knew it. "You're not a servant there," he said. "The governess." "I see." He asked me to take his horse by the bridle and bring it over. Then, leaning on my shoulder, he mounted the saddle. "Necessity compels me to accept your offer of help," he said. "Hand me my whip. It lies under the hedge. That will be all. Thank you." He galloped towards Thornfield without giving me one more glance. I went on to the village, mailed Mrs. Fairfax's letter, and hurried back. The sun was setting when I reached the gate. It wasn't that dark yet, but the windows of the house were ablaze with candlelight. When I entered, the front hall was bright with light coming through the doors of the large dining room. I stood still in amazement. Mrs. Fairfax came out of the dining room, saw my expression on my face, and smiled. "Mr. Rochester has just come home," she said. "He's now with the doctor. Apparently, he had a fall and sprained his ankle." I went up to my room to take off my coat, then down to the library. "Oh, no, miss," the maid told me. "When the master is home, that's where the master sits." Mrs. Fairfax explained that from now on I should be using the parlor on the second floor. I had supper that night alone. The next morning, I was at my wit's end, trying to keep Adele in hand. "Mr. Rochester is home! Mr. Rochester is home!" she kept saying. "He's brought me a trunk full of presents. I saw it." She prattled on and on. The trunk contained a doll. The trunk contained a doll house. The trunk contained new dresses. I did not see Mrs. Fairfax all day. She was too busy. Now that Mr. Rochester was here, she had many more things to see to. The rooms that have been unused all these months had to be aired out and dusted. More groceries had to be ordered, larger meals prepared. Neighbors came to pay their respects, or to discuss business. What with the endless parade of visitors, and the servants bustling about to keep everything in order, there was constant commotion. Finally, that evening, I was called downstairs. "Oh no, Miss Eyre," Mrs. Fairfax said. "You have to change your dress. Mr. Rochester would like you and Adele to take tea with him." I went back to my room and put on the one nice dress I had. It was a simple black silk dress. The only jewelry I possessed was a small pin made of pearls that Miss Temple had given me as a goodbye gift. I wore it, hoping it would make the dress look nicer. Before going out the door, I glanced at myself swiftly in the mirror. What was the use of staring longer at my face? I was plain. I knew I was plain. I took a few steps into the large drawing room and stood still. Mr. Rochester was lying on a sofa, resting his sprained ankle on a cushion. Adele was sitting on the floor by his feet. Mrs. Fairfax sat in a straight-backed chair near the fireplace. I did not know how to proceed. I knew Mr. Rochester was aware that I had entered the room and was standing a few feet away from him. But he did not turn his head toward me, as though he was not in the mood to notice anyone. "Miss Eyre is here, sir," Mrs. Fairfax said. He bowed. "Let Miss Eyre be seated," he said. With the cold, formal way in which he said it, and with the forced, stiff way in which he bowed, it was as if he were really saying, "I don't give a hoot that she's here or not here." Reader, his rudeness set me at ease. Had he been polite, had he acted like a true gentleman, I would have felt shy. I did not have a refined, high society manner to respond to a gentleman in kind. Rudeness I could deal with. Besides, I liked him for being rude. Rudeness is not hypocritical the way politeness often is. For a while, no one spoke or moved. A servant brought in the tea, and Mrs. Fairfax poured. "Will you hand Mr. Rochester his tea?" she said to me. "I'd ask Adele, but I'm afraid she'll spill it." I did as I was told. Mr. Rochester took the cup from my hand without looking at me. "What brought you here, Miss Eyre?" he said. "I needed a job." "Of course you needed a job. You wouldn't be working unless you needed a job. What brought you to Thornfield Hall?" I advertised in the paper, and Mrs. Fairfax answered my ad. "And how lucky that was," said Mrs. Fairfax. "It's just been wonderful to have Miss Eyre here. She's been an excellent companion for me, and a great teacher for Adele." "Mrs. Fairfax," said Mr. Rochester, "I did not ask you for a character reference. I can judge Miss Eyre's character for myself. Already I know that she scared my horse and made me fall. I have her to thank for this sprain. It was hard to tell whether he was joking or not. "So," he said, "what are you doing out on the road?" Who are you waiting for? Who were you waiting for?" "I was on my way to the village to post a letter for Mrs. Fairfax," I said. He turned his face to me and stared. Could it be my imagination, reader? I thought I saw a sudden softness in his eyes. In a moment, it was gone. He turned his face away. "Do you play the piano?" he said, without looking at me. "A little. Everyone plays a little," he said. "Go into the library and play something for me." I obeyed. "Enough," he called out after a few minutes. "You play like any other young woman. Perhaps better than some, but not well." I closed the piano and went back. "I understand you can draw," he said. "Let me see some of your drawings." I went up to my room and brought back some of my drawings. "You have some talent," he said. He looked through the drawings I had given him and handed them back to me. "Talent, but not much skill. Now you may leave, and take the child with you." Adele went to kiss him goodnight. He turned to her a stony cheek, then pushed her off of him the way one does a dog that's making a nuisance of itself. "I wish you both a good night," he said. He might as well have said, "Dismissed." I curtsied, received a frigid bow in return, took Adele by the hand, and left the room. After I put Adele to bed, I went to Mrs. Fairfax's room and waited for her. I wanted to get some information about Mr. Rochester. He had piqued my interest, to say the least. This is what I learned. He had been the master of Thornfield Hall for the last 9 years, since the death of his older brother. Till his brother's death, he had chosen to live abroad, where, it was said, he had led a dissolute life. While living in Paris, he befriended an opera singer who had a young child, Adele. When Mr. Rochester realized that the child was neglected and mistreated, he decided to take her away and give her a good home at Thornfield. Only a good man would take it upon himself to take care of a neglected child, I thought. And yet, he did not show any true affection towards the poor girl. I could not make him out.